do a special ceremony at the very end. After he's done, I want to remind you that we're going to begin the march behind us, and all women, children, strollers. So I would hope that everybody would make room for families to go first. Okay, Rabbi Lotker.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Today is Saturday, the Sabbath. Jews, rabbis like me, are supposed to be home resting and not out doing things like this. Some might say I'm violating the Sabbath, but according to Jewish law, when matters of health and safety and life and death are at risk, we are commanded to take action. We are commanded not to rest. Commandments are important in Judaism. We believe they are not suggestions. We believe they are commandments. We are commanded to do many things because sometimes it's hard to know what to do or how we feel, but our tradition suggests it doesn't matter so much how we feel, but only what's right and wrong. Do you know what the most repeated commandment in the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, is? It's not to love God. That's only mentioned once. It's not to love your neighbor. That's only mentioned once. It's not to love your spouse, to love your parents, to love your children. Those aren't mentioned at all. Those aren't commandments. By the way, you're supposed to honor your parents. That's mentioned twice. 36 times in the Hebrew Bible we are commanded to care for the powerless in society. To love. Don't applaud me, applaud my boss. We are commanded to love the stranger, to protect the widow, the fatherless, to care for people who can't necessarily care for themselves. We've heard about a policy of zero tolerance. You know, intolerance is not such a new thing. You remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah when the cries reach God's ear and God takes action. So people ask the question, what were the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah? And you may be surprised. The prophets and the rabbis all agree the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were intolerance, were refusal to welcome immigrants, to welcome the stranger, and to take care of them. We Jews are motivated by the story of the Exodus from Egypt, where we had an administration that ordered the separation of families. And we had some people that rebelled against, even high government officials, that repelled against that administration. The Hebrew midwife saved the lives of children. Pharaoh's own daughter saved the baby Moses. And many women conspired to save Moses, Moses' sister, Moses' mother, and Pharaoh's daughter. Intolerance stinks. Intolerance of race stinks. Intolerance of religion stinks. Intolerance of one's national origin stinks. Intolerance of whom you love stinks. You know, even lactose intolerance stinks. What we are seeing now is a war of terror. Not a war on terror, but a war of terror. What this administration is telling people who are fleeing, literally fleeing for their lives from the Americas, from all around us, what we are telling them is, you think you have it bad at home? You think things are terrible at home? Well, we can make it worse here. We will have our terror, sponsored by our tax dollars, even worse than the worst gangs that you might face back home, but people come nonetheless. The chosen interest of this government's war on terror, war of terror, is to terrorize children, is to tear them literally from their mothers, from their fathers, inflicting lasting psychological and physical harm on these defenseless children. So what's our role? Judaism teaches that God could have made a perfect world. No intolerance, no war, no disease, no problems whatsoever. But if God had made the world that way, what would our job be? We would have nothing to do this afternoon. So instead, Judaism teaches us that God sends us into the world as messengers. The Hebrew word for messenger is malach. It's the same as the Hebrew word for angel. So God has sent you angels here to make this world a little bit more like the one that God has in mind. God has sent you angels here to witness, to be a witness to the idea that laws of God's morality, of treating people as though they're created in the image of God, of recognizing the humanity in each of us, are of a higher standard than the laws passed by nations. I heard a government official who was asked about how, in this case, he felt about separating children from their families, and his response is, well, I was just enforcing the laws. We are here just to enforce the law. It made me remember the trials at Nuremberg, when the Nazis said, well, we were just following orders. Everything that happened in Nazi Germany was legal. The laws of the state of Nazi Germany were legal. That doesn't mean that they were right. Our job is to be a witness to the idea that to say I'm only following orders, I'm only following the law, is an obscenity. In the Bible, there is a very interesting idea of every 50th year we are to proclaim what is called in Hebrew the Yovel, in English the Jubilee year. And I'll quote from the book of Leviticus. It says, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. If that sounds familiar, that same phrase is inscribed on the Liberty Bell. And so we Jews every year sound the shofar, a biblical instrument, one of the oldest instruments in the world, and we sound it at the end of the Yom Kippur service, and we sound what is called a Tekiah Gedolah. I'm going to blow this little baby until I turn bright red. And afterwards we are going to march. And it reminded me of the story of Moses at the shores of the sea. And Moses is praying and telling the people, I'm going to lead you. And the tradition says Moses is praying and praying, and God says to Moses, Matzahak Ali, Alai. Why are you crying out to me? God tells Moses, you know what, there's a time to pray, and thank you, Julie, for praying, but there is a time to get moving. In some cases, the enemy is behind you, and God has opened up a path in front of us, and it's time to get moving. So we'll see how long I can do this.
Tekiah Gedolah.